Pursuit of progress.
I'm Adam Reilly. Tonight on Greater Boston, as we inch closer to Election Day, the clock is ticking for prosecutors to make their case against Donald Trump. With criminal charges and Trump's eligibility for office up in the air, a new Frontline documentary digs into the evidence against him. The filmmaker joins me ahead. And then Steward Healthcare's financial crisis is taking a toll on community nonprofits. And a local teacher, poet, and actress recounts the moment she hit her breaking point. As Donald Trump campaigns for the office that he tried to steal in the last election, the Supreme Court's weighing whether his role in the January 6th riot disqualifies him from the race. And a federal appeals court ruled this week that Trump is not immune from the federal criminal charges he faces for the insurrection. A new Frontline documentary explores the roots of the case.
The president's intent was to stay in power at all costs.
This election was stolen.
The Select Committee laid the path down for the Department of Justice.
The film was called Democracy on Trial, and the director, producer, and writer, Michael Kirk, joins me now. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here, Adam.
So, did working on this film make you more or less optimistic about the future of our country?
This is the 7th or 8th film I've made about the Trump presidency in one form or another, including The Choice, our quadrennial every 4-year big comparison of the candidates.
Staple.
I never, ever, ever felt positive about American democracy during this time. It's always challenging, no matter who the president is, because we know so much about it. We get ourselves very involved, and we make these big, long films, and the White House is essentially our beat. So there's plenty of reason for pessimism, but there was even more reason once we started to follow Trump closely and all the way through election night on 2020.
You spent a lot of time in this film reviewing the work that the January 6th committee did and talking with people who were steering that work behind the scenes, also people who we saw as witnesses, but you learn a little more about their perspective over the course of this film. And I want to play a little small piece of your conversation with, tell me if I get the pronunciation right, Rusty Bowers.
Rusty Bowers.
Rusty Bowers, the Arizona Speaker of the House, who was pressured by Donald Trump to endorse a slate of false electors and resisted that pressure. Let's take a look.
For someone to ask me to deny my oath and just let the courts figure it out, or let somebody else punt it to someone else, is not something I will do. It's my oath. And I hope that I'll never break that. I know I'm not perfect. I'm certainly not a perfect witness. But I am a witness.
Did any of the conversations that you had with the staffers from the committee or the people who testified before the committee change your perspective on the committee's work and achievements?
I had watched the hearings live, the sort of mini-series that were created out of those hearings, unlike any Washington hearing I'd ever seen. I started when I was in college watching the Watergate hearings, so I'm used to those kind of hearings. And I've been in Washington lots of times for hearings. This one was very different, and they ran it almost like a TV show, almost like the TV show we made.
They brought in a producer, right?
They did, from ABC News, James Golton, the former president of ABC News, and they really did make it with the intention of getting an audience. They did. They got 19 million people that very first night. That's equivalent to a Monday Night Football crowd on television. So did it change my perspective? I'm not sure. I had seen it. What I loved getting to know people like Mr. Bowers a lot better and understand the importance of the event to them. I think they didn't quite get to all of that in the hearings. We were much more interested in the behind the scenes and who was he and what was it about of the character.
And that really does come to the fore with all these people you talk about, what this meant to them, both people on the committee and people who worked with the committee. And he's an incredibly compelling character, I got to say.
He really is. And it's an amazing thing that it gives, changing perspective, by the way, it gives me a little optimism, a tiny bit of optimism for the future when you see that 3 or 4 of the people that we interview in the film and that are in the film were people that Giuliani and or Trump tried to influence so that they would do something that from their perspective was illegal. But here's the kicker. They were Republicans. They were supporters of President Trump, hardcore, in Rusty Bowers' case, also LDS, very, very conservative, very pro-Donald Trump. But at the moment that they're asking him to do something without any evidence, he faces this question of, do I break my oath? And that, to me, gave me great optimism for the future, because in every case, the people who were Trump people working in state government, being asked to do something that they consider to be illegal, wouldn't change their opinion because it was breaking their oath.
But at the same time, if you want to be negative, you can flip that around, right? And say this result, the outcome that we got out of this horrible period was contingent on so many people doing the right thing. And if we're in a similar situation, what are the odds that everyone who's being pressured is in fact going to resist that pressure?
Well, that's the question, and that's the issue in a lot of ways, because it is true that the second go-around for the Trump team, a new Trump team that's helping him through this election, is working very hard, has worked very hard to populate state governments around the country, especially in the 6 big states that are really in play. Lots of everything else is all kind of, we know how it's going to go. But in 6 key states, Arizona, Wisconsin, Georgia, Pennsylvania, those places have been, there have been real efforts by the Republicans, Trump Republicans, to change the population of who will be deciding things if there is another contested election. And I think it looks very clearly like there will be another contested election, no matter how it goes.
Right, because he's back. In terms of there being another contested election, one of the points raised in the film is the extent to which Trump's refusal to accept the outcome was telegraphed incredibly clearly in that year when he repeatedly said that the only way he would lose was if the election was fraudulent, said it again and again and again. And even in things he'd done before, like when he didn't win an Emmy for The Apprentice, and he claimed that it was a rigged decision process at the Emmys.
That's right.
So I'm wondering why you think so few people were inclined to take that scenario seriously before it played out. I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, but I thought it was plain as day. Yeah, if he loses, he's going to say it wasn't legit. But not a lot of people seemed to anticipate what was coming or really thought he would do it. Why do you think that is?
Well, even I, who know him, I'm a sort of biographer. I'm a television version of the biographer. I ought to know. But when he said it that night, I remember shaking my head and saying, oh my God, he really is going to do it, because it is such an outrageous, never before been done kind of a thing that an American presidential candidate would say, I won this election. You all saw it, I won the election, when in fact we were all watching as he wasn't winning the election, especially when the votes from the mail-in ballots and others were starting to be counted. So it was clear that he got the early hit. Very obvious that what everybody, the pollsters had been saying, which is wait for later in the evening, wait for
we all
what's
knew that
going
was
to
going to come.
We all knew it, but he apparently didn't know it, or didn't want to believe it, or had no intention of knowing it or believing it. It's hard to get in his head, but it is obvious from his actions that he was ready to go.
The Supreme Court right now is taking up the question of whether he is in fact eligible to run again under the 14th Amendment. You, at one point in the film, highlight David French, the conservative but anti-Trump commentator, talking about the importance of that particular case. Let's take a look.
The questions being raised right now regarding presidential immunity are absolutely key to the very foundation, the very philosophical foundation of this republic. Because if you take an oath of office in the United States of America, you're swearing an oath to our system of government. And so if a president is not subject to that system of government, if he's not subject to that code of laws, we don't have quite the republic that we thought we had.
You are a documentarian, not a prognosticator, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are as the court takes this up and what you think the consequences will be if they say he can run again and if they say he can't. In a minute.
Well, it only took me 2.5 hours to get to this exact point in the movie. It's it's anybody's guess what he'll do. He loves this attention, whatever it is, and unless he's knocked off all the ballots at once, his intention is to use the courts and use the trials, not as a prosecution, but as a persecution. I know he's using those anterooms right outside of courthouses as campaign stops along the way. It's fascinating to watch him do it. He is not intimidated and never has been, going all the way back to Jim Comey and Bob Mueller. He is not intimidated by all of this rule of law stuff. He doesn't believe in the rule of law, and he's not going to follow the rules.
All right, on that note, Michael Kirk, thank you very much. Appreciate it. The film is excellent.
Thank you.
Next up, Steward Healthcare is deep in debt, putting the future of its 9 Massachusetts hospitals at risk. And as the flailing company shirks its financial obligations on several fronts, GBH News' Jeremy Seagull reports that community nonprofits connected to Steward are also taking a big hit. And he joins me now with more. Jeremy, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Adam.
How'd you find out that this is happening?
This came through GBH's community outreach efforts. Over the past couple years, we've really intentionally set out to talk to people who live in the communities around us and our neighbors here in Allston-Brighton. And someone who works for an organization, the Allston-Brighton Health Collaborative, reached out to us saying that Steward Healthcare owed them a bunch of money. So after they reached out, I said, this is interesting. We're going to look more into it. And what we found is that Steward Healthcare owed this organization $50,000 of $150,000 that it promised to pay for a program that serves low-income residents of Allston-Brighton at the Brighton Farmers Market to get coupons to help them get healthy meals and free food, essentially, to bring home to their families.
These are the veggie vouchers, right?
They're veggie vouchers,
That's the moniker for it. And that's a program run by the Allston-Brighton Health Collaborative?
It's run by the Allston-Brighton Health Collaborative, Steward Healthcare, or St. Elizabeth's Hospital, rather, which is owned by Steward Healthcare, the largest private physician-owned healthcare system in the country, which owns 9 hospitals in Massachusetts. It promised to provide all of the funding for this program.
$50,000 a year for 3 years, and none of that's been paid.
Exactly.
What are the other organizations that have not gotten money that Steward had committed to giving them? Because there's a few.
There's several of them. After the Allston-Brighton Health Collaborative reached out to us and we found out about their situation, I began reaching out to other groups and uncovering the fact that Steward Healthcare, St. Elizabeth's Hospital, they promised to pay more than $600,000 over the past few years. That community funding has essentially become nothing. And community advocates who I've spoken to, the heads of nonprofits, say that this has all happened since Steward Health took over St. Elizabeth's. This is a hospital that's been around for decades and decades and decades, a pillar of the community. It was bought by a for-profit place, and essentially in the decades since then, they've noticed a complete retraction from community support.
I want to mention a couple other organizations. Allston-Brighton Pauses, which is a substance abuse or runs substance abuse programs. The Coalition of Racial Equity and Mental Health, which gives scholarships, not totally a ton, I think like $15,000 annually of scholarships for people who are living in the area and getting degrees. You looked at emails that went back and forth between the Allston-Brighton Health Collaborative and the leadership of St. Elizabeth's Hospital. What was the texture of those exchanges as St. Elizabeth's refused to or failed to deliver on these commitments?
It was fascinating to read these emails because we've all heard so much about the dire situation financially that Steward Healthcare is in, but this gave a real glimpse into how it's affecting people's interactions with each other, especially when it comes to money. So I had emails that I reviewed that showed the Allston-Brighton Health Collaborative reaching out to St. Elizabeth's Hospital saying, hey, thank you so much for providing this grant money to run this veggie voucher program. We haven't received a check yet. What's going on with that? The hospital got back to them saying, we're going to pay you for that. They brought it up the chain as they continued to not hear back.
In a very kind of sunny, don't worry about it, right? Oh yeah, like this money is
coming,
flying out the door any day now.
There were emails with Paul C. Smith, who is the president of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, also with the CFO of St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Each of them literally says the check is on the way.
Yeah.
We're writing this now. It's going to be coming. And a month would go by. They would reach back out again. The check was still never there. And then eventually, the hospital stopped responding to them entirely. And that's when they decided we should reach out to GBH so they can figure out what's happening here.
It's probably worth noting that St. Elizabeth's did not say it was going to provide this funding for good deeds, good programs. They didn't do it out of the goodness of their heart, right? They did it because they wanted to build a new garage on their hospital campus. And tell me if I'm getting this correct, the city of Boston basically required that they provide community benefits in exchange for the right to build.
Exactly. Anytime that there's a huge development, the city requires that organizations, that companies do these community benefits. And the Allston-Brighton Health Collaborative was one of several organizations included in this. There are tens of thousands of dollars on the line in what they're promising in community benefits. And community leaders think it's unlikely that any of that is going to come through in the years ahead, including that $15,000 a year scholarship, which, you know, sounds like a small amount of money when you consider the millions of dollars that's involved with something like Steward Healthcare. But for the people receiving that scholarship, that's huge, and that's in the Allston-Brighton community. One thing worth noting is that even before this garage proposal, St. Elizabeth's did provide a lot of community support to the Allston-Brighton community, including to the Allston-Brighton Health Collaborative. And in previous years, it was out of the goodness of their heart. And as Steward took over, some of that started going away. You would have proposals like this hospital where they were required to give community giving, and they promised that money. And now we're seeing that that money might never come to these organizations.
The hospital has indicated to you, they're still saying, don't give up hope to these people, right?
Yeah, I reached out to the hospital for comment, and I heard directly from the president, Paul C. Smith, and he actually apologized in his statement, which I've heard from the Health Collaborative afterwards. That's the first time they've heard anything like that from him. He said he was sorry. He can understand why they feel that he and the hospital strung them along, and that he still plans to provide the money, and that the hospital still plans to build this garage and provide the other community funding. But as I said, given Steward's financial situation, community leaders and people on the Boston City Council who I've spoken to say they feel it's unlikely that this garage is going to happen and that this money for the community is going to come through.
I want to close by asking you, it's not just when it comes to the future and the consequences of Steward's struggles for this particular neighborhood, it's not just about charitable funding, right? It's also about the economic impact that St. Elizabeth's has in this area as a massive employer, right?
St. Elizabeth's is the largest employer in the Allston-Brighton area. So while this money for community groups matters a lot, an entire community's future is on the line. These are jobs for people who live in this neighborhood in Boston and a community that relies on St. Elizabeth's for healthcare, often low-income people who rely on it for healthcare. They've relied on it for decades, and there's a huge fear that given what's happening with Steward, and Steward, you know, has said that they plan to keep providing healthcare. They didn't give me comment on whether they plan to close St. Elizabeth's, which there have been reports that there are hospital closures coming. They plan on continuing to provide care, but for people in the community, for leaders in the community, there's a fear that the hospital could go away someday.
That's a lot to worry about.
Yeah.
Huge vacuum that will be left. All right, Jeremy Seagull, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Finally tonight, in most situations, most of us usually try to do the right thing, but sometimes that switch flips and we lose control. For local teacher, artist, and storyteller Ashley Rose, that moment came after a flood in her Roslindale neighborhood. She shared more on GBH's original series, Stories from the Stage, and we bring you that story now as part of a new partnership with that show and this one.
I teach STEAM, so I teach science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics at a all-black charter school over in Dorchester. But when I'm not doing that, I'm a poet and actress in Boston, so I spend a lot of time on the stage in various capacities.
Oh, that's great. What are your thoughts about the ability of stories to connect people across cultures?
To me, this is the only way in which people around the world have ever really learned, and learning should be accessible whether or not you're literate or not. So when I think of storytelling, it's been the only way that people of all walks have been able to communicate, learn, share their culture, and hopefully change the world. To me, it's been through storytelling, a sharing space with stories.
Yeah. So when you consider people who grew up maybe very differently than you did, how can they or couldn't they relate to your stories?
They would always relate to them because I believe that human beings relate. I'm pretty sure if you have my generation, you watched Reading Rainbow, you watched Wishbone, you watched Ghostwriter. Storylines are everywhere, especially in art. I'm pretty sure if you watch Scandal nowadays. But this idea of being able to tell your perspective and be heard, I think it goes across any backgrounds, no matter whether or not you grew up in a suburb or grew up in the same setting I grew up in. I grew up in Rosendale on a dead-end street called Delford. I was born in 1985, so I existed on Rosendale probably for about the first 12 years of my life, and I would say was a bit of a utopia. A lot of people think of America as a melting pot at this time period. No, my street was a tossed salad. We had a little bit of everybody, and everyone brought their own flavor, their own style. I learned about convergent and divergent boundaries from people who escaped these volcanic islands that erupted from Montserrat. I learned about Puerto Rican culture and that Puerto Ricans, some of them were black. I was like, oh my God, this was just all these learning experiences. I was raised by Cambodians. I had a little bit of everything in Rosendale, and it was perfect until a day in 1996. When Boston decided to drown a whole bunch of poor immigrants in Rosendale. On this particular day in 1996, it wasn't raining, it was drizzling, all right? So doing what I always do on Sundays with my brother, I decided that I wanted my bacon, egg, and cheese, and being a little sister, my brother's like, you're gonna go to the store to get the eggs. I'm like, all right, cool, whatever, Josh, I'll do it. So I go get my eggs, but the first thing I realize is, why am I hopping over puddles to get over Washington Street to Four Brothers Market? All right, whatever, let me just get the eggs. I head on home. By the time I get home, I realize the water's starting to pool at the side of the sidewalks a little more. The water's not going down, but it's really not raining. This is kind of weird, but I'm just gonna watch Ghost Rider and keep minding my business, all right? Eventually, we start to hear the water. The dogs start to congregate on the third floor and howl. The cats start to pace. Me being from Rosendale, growing up in Arboretums, I know you trust animals, all right? So I'm like, something's wrong. Eventually, I hear the sound of water. Sounds like it's coming from the basement. Me and my brother, being the investigators that we are, go into the basement and realize that there is brown and black water pouring in from the back of the basement, and it's coming in pretty fast. Eventually, it opens the door and we can't close the door. So we're like, okay, well, let's just call Mom. Ma's at work. My mom works in Cambridge. Ma, the house is flooding. Ashley, it can't be flooding. I'm in Cambridge. It's not raining. I know, but it's flooding. Within the next hour, there's a firefighter at our door saying that we have to leave on a raft. This is Rosendale, y'all. This is Rosendale, okay? A raft. Ma, I gotta leave on a raft. All right, I'm just gonna get the cat to the dog and get on a raft. The guy says, you can't bring the cats and the dogs. I said, well, then you know I'm not going. I go onto this whole tangent, Noah's Ark, I'm not leaving. Punky didn't leave Brandon, I'm not doing it. Leave me here, I'm going down with the ship. One of my neighbors come over and said, Ashley, get in this raft. And this was back in the day when your neighbor could still like discipline you. So I said, all right, I'm gonna get in a raft and go. I end up at the Rosendale Community Center, which is, at the Archdale Community Center, which is now the Menino Center. And it's pretty fun, because this is where I play basketball every day. I'm like, get there, this group called FEMA passes me a hat, a flashlight, and a car. I'm like, I can play basketball, my mother's not here. This is great. All right, this works till my mother shows up with the cat in the bag, literally. I'm like, yeah, you saved my cat, Ma, you're the best, but you smell like sewage. She looks like, all right, Ash, take the cat, but my mom doesn't look like her normal self. I'm like, maybe it's because she's wet. Once she dries off, she'll be back to normal. Ma, look, I'm like, Ma, what's wrong? What's wrong with the house? She says, everything's underwater. We can't go back to the house. I'm like, well, Mom, we're at the gym, that's fine. She said, but my mom doesn't look normal at this point. I'm starting to get a little more worried, but we have 4 days at this community center. On the 5th day, my friends called FEMA leave. Little did I know they would leave us floating on faith forever. After that, we had to live in cars because the community center had to turn back into a gym eventually. We lived in cars for 2 weeks. Eventually, my mom, being from New York City, having no family, ended up breaking back into the condemned apartments because we realized they flooded us with sewage. So we could no longer live there, but my mom had nowhere to go, so she becomes a squatter. We squat in this apartment illegally for 7 to 8 months until eventually my mom wins a apartment. She actually wins a home off of watching TV for the first time. It was Oprah had a show on a special called Habitat for Humanity. Right, clap for Oprah, right? Love Oprah. And I look at her and said, Mom, we should apply for this Habitat for Humanity thing. She's like, Ashley, don't you realize I lose everything? I just lost a house, I lost everything. I said, Mom, I just won the Easter egg raffle. I win everything, all right? So we're both going back and forth. I decided, you know what, Mom, I'm gonna apply. Because my English teacher said that I'm a good writer. The application comes, I apply. Lo and behold, 2 weeks later, I told you so. We got picked for the Habitat for Humanity house. I'm like, yay! Now that's what a clap for Habitat. It spent 1 year, college kids, church missionaries, volunteers, helped me rebuild a house that my mom still owns and lives on Hansborough Street in Dorchester. I get a scholarship to college, my life's put back together. I go back, make sure I help out for Habitat for Humanity when Hurricane Katrina hits, because it's the cycle of giving, but I still hate FEMA. I hate FEMA. I get you. The wrath of revenge and hate that I had for them never left. It actually didn't leave, I would say, until about 2 weeks ago. I end up about to be able to perform at a special event, and I'm happen to go over there like, oh, Ashley, you're a poet. I hear you write a lot about housing rights. And I go into this whole tangent about being displaced and flooded. And this random guy in the audience stands up and says, I'm sorry. I said, you are sorry for interrupting me like that, guy. Like, what are you doing? He goes, no, ma'am, I was on that team 20 years ago from FEMA. I look at this man with the wrath of hate. It was a Get Out moment. If you guys ever seen Get Out when she stirs the cup, I immediately start, just as people know, I immediately start to cry. I'm like, you're from where? He says, I'm from FEMA, and I have to stand here and ask you for forgiveness. I was new, I was in my 20s. I remember what they did to you, the Cambodians, the Lebanese. He starts to name, he said, your street's the street with the, we say at the same time, the wall. Rosendale, if you go from Forest Hills down, is a valley at first, if you know that. Rosendale literally goes into a bucket. There was no way you would escape. And the one thing I had to look at, he said, I didn't forget about your street, and I can't lie, over recent times when these hurricanes have hit Houston, Tampa, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, I always say, I saw this early in my career, and it happened on a street on Delford. Will you forgive me? I look at him with the wrath of hate in my eyes, remembering the depression that my mom still hasn't left, remembering how we had no homes, how I had to explain to the Timothy School why I had no clean clothes, how you never came back to save us. I thought about, though, the fact that I got a scholarship to college, that Habitat for Humanity gave me the one thing I needed, that I thought I needed the most, which was a house. And then I realized right then and then, God might have been working in the funniest ways. I didn't need a house. This man gave me the one thing that I needed for 30 years, and that was an apology. Thank you.
You can catch more Stories from the Stage Mondays at 9:30 p.m. on World and Fridays at 8 here on GBH2 or anytime on the Stories from the Stage Facebook page and YouTube channel. And in less than a week, you can catch some stories in person at the Stories from the Stage live Valentine's Day soiree. For tickets, head to gbh.org/events. That's it for tonight, but do come back tomorrow for Talking Politics. Katie Lannon is kindly filling in for me. She'll talk to former Mass GOP Chair Jennifer Nassour, who's now the chair of Nikki Haley's Massachusetts campaign, about Haley's underwhelming showing in Nevada and how her campaign plans to push forward. Plus, my conversation with former Bay State Banner senior editor Yabu Miller on his new journalism nonprofit, the Greater Boston News Bureau. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thanks for watching. I'm Adam Reilly. Good night.
Laura Simmons